They said his muscles couldn't bend the law. But what Arnold did next rewrote the rules of justice forever. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The federal courtroom in downtown San Francisco was quiet enough to hear the rustle of a notepad or the shuffle of a nervous foot. Marble walls absorbed attention like cold stone lungs, and the wood-paneled ceiling echoed every sound back with reverence. Rows of journalists and legal scholars filled the gallery, their pens poised, their eyes focused on one man, Arnold Schwarzenegger. He sat at the defendant's table, not in a suit tailored for the red carpet, but in a simple navy blazer, his posture calm, hands folded. The iconic face, once projected larger than life across movie screens worldwide, was now drawn into stillness beneath the gaze of the bench. At the head of the courtroom, U.S. District Judge Edward Chen adjusted his glasses. 70 years old, razor-sharp, and appointed during the Obama administration, Chen had developed a reputation for legal rigor and zero tolerance for theatrics. He leaned forward slightly, the corners of his mouth twitching, not with anger, but with something worse, amusement. "Mr. Schwarzenegger," he began, voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "You presented an emergency motion to halt the closure of the Oakland Community Youth Center, citing public good, historical significance, and your own personal investment in the project." He paused. Arnold didn't move. "You argue that the loss of this facility would irreparably harm vulnerable minors. But unfortunately, good intentions are not legal tender." A ripple of tension moved through the gallery, like the tightening of a wire. Chen didn't stop there. "You are not above the law because of your past accomplishments," he said, his tone growing firmer. "This courtroom does not recognize fame as authority. It recognizes statutes, evidence, and precedent." Arnold remained composed. His eyes, a steel blue, held their focus. "And let me be perfectly clear," Judge Chen continued, now lifting his voice slightly. "You cannot run a justice system on biceps and movie quotes. This isn't a film set, Mr. Schwarzenegger. This is a court of law." A beat of silence followed. Then, quietly but unmistakably, a short chuckle escaped the judge's lips. A smirk, a signal. Laughter rippled to the back rows, brief, muted, but real. A reporter near the aisle tapped furiously on his phone. Seconds later, a tweet began to spread. "The Terminator just got terminated in court." At the table, Arnold blinked once, slowly. His fingers tightened just slightly on the edge of his notes. But he didn't speak. He didn't even glance toward the gallery. The laughter faded, replaced by a renewed stillness. The prosecutor, a young but assertive representative of the state finance department, rose confidently and began reiterating that the Oakland Community Youth Center had failed to meet basic compliance thresholds, outdated fire codes, unpaid property taxes, and operating without the appropriate funding certifications required by the California Department of Social Services. As he listed each technical infraction, the words hung in the air like nails on a coffin. Arnold's legal counsel tried to interject, referencing the thousands of at-risk children who had come through the center's doors, many of whom had gone on to college, the military, and stable lives. But Judge Chen interrupted with a flat hand gesture. "The court has reviewed those testimonies," he said, his tone clipped. "We are not here to debate sentiment. We are here to enforce law." Again, Arnold remained silent, but a quiet shift had begun in his eyes. Where there had been calm acceptance, something colder was rising. Not resentment, but calculation. This was not the first time he had stood alone in a hostile room. Not the first time he'd been told he didn't belong. He had arrived in America with a duffel bag and a dream, mocked for his accent, dismissed as a musclehead. He had broken through walls before, not with force, but with strategy, with relentlessness, with resolve. The judge turned another page in his binder. "Unless your counsel can produce newly filed compliance documents from the state treasury or an injunction from a higher court, this center will be subject to enforcement action within 48 hours. The weight of the words settled like concrete. The room was still. Somewhere near the door, a teenage girl sitting in the spectator section clutched a warm manila folder labeled Youth Portfolio. Dreams and Goals. She looked at Arnold, her eyes wide. He gave no visible response, but something in him locked into place. Judge Chen leaned back. Motion denied. There it was. The gavel didn't even need to fall for everyone to feel the finality of that sentence. Arnold nodded just once. He did not argue. He did not rise. He simply sat there, breathing evenly, as the machinery of the courtroom shifted gears around him. His attorney leaned in to whisper, but he didn't seem to hear. Instead, his gaze drifted downward to a simple photo paper-clipped to his notes. It was a picture of a young boy, no older than 9, standing in front of the Oakland Center, holding up a certificate of completion from a conflict resolution course. Written in crayon on the back were the words, "Mr. Arnold taught me to solve things without fists." He turned the photo over slowly, pressing it flat against the table. Outside the court, clouds were beginning to gather, dimming the daylight. Inside, Arnold's eyes did not blink. There was no anger in his face, no pain, only a quiet intensity, the stillness of a man not defeated, but waiting, calculating. The judge rose, and the courtroom followed, wooden benches creaking in unison. But Arnold didn't stand. Not yet. He didn't need to. Not until the next move. He had once stood behind the podium of the state capitol, cameras flashing, voices cheering. Every word he spoke becoming a headline. Now he sat in a courtroom, silent, being told that his legacy meant nothing in the face of tax codes and legal procedures. The transformation was almost too brutal to believe. Outside the courthouse, the news vans had already picked their angles. Arnold's last stand read one segment teaser on a local channel. Another framed it as a man clinging to relevance. But what the headlines didn't see, what few ever did, was the reason he was there in the first place. The Oakland Community Youth Center wasn't just a building. It was the first of over 30 centers he had helped establish during his time as governor. More than just gymnasiums and classrooms, they were sanctuaries for children with nowhere else to go. It started with a promise. Years ago, after visiting a juvenile detention facility and seeing a 13-year-old boy in handcuffs, Arnold had said quietly to his staff, "We need to catch them before the streets do." That promise became California Works, a network of safe spaces that offered everything from tutoring and trade training to emotional counseling and food security. And now, the original center, the one where it all began, was days away from being shuttered under the weight of unpaid property taxes and code violations. The courtroom didn't care that some of its graduates had gone on to become teachers, Marines, even lawyers. It didn't matter that Arnold himself had covered budget shortfalls from his own pocket for years, declining speaking fees and funneling them back into the program. What mattered, Judge Chen made clear, was compliance. The irony wasn't lost on Arnold. In a system where children could be abandoned by the state for being non-compliant, so too could the very places meant to save them. Earlier that morning, a dozen kids had gathered outside the courthouse steps, holding cardboard signs in shaky handwriting. Some wrote, "My brother changed here." Others simply said, "Don't close our home." A security guard told them they weren't allowed to demonstrate without a permit. Most of them left quietly. One stayed. She sat on the bottom step, arms wrapped around a sketch pad. No one noticed her, but Arnold had seen her through the tinted window of the SUV as he arrived. And when the guard asked her to leave, she didn't argue. She just closed the sketch pad and whispered, "I thought justice was for everyone." Back in the courtroom, Arnold's attorney tapped through his tablet, scrolling for any last-minute injunctions. "The judge won't budge," he muttered. "We need another strategy." But Arnold didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the seal behind the judge's bench, the great eagle above the scales of justice. He remembered standing beneath that same symbol years ago when he signed the executive order to fund the very centers now being torn apart by bureaucracy. Then he had been surrounded by applause. Now, it was as if the system itself had turned to mock him. The prosecutor, a clean-cut young man in his 30s, approached the press afterward with a confident air. "Mr. Schwarzenegger's passion is admirable," he said, "but the law must be applied equally. Sentiment cannot override statute." When asked whether he had ever visited the Oakland Center, he paused. "It's not relevant to this case," he replied before walking away. But to Arnold, it was the most relevant thing of all. Inside the courtroom, his past and present had collided. A man once known for toppling villains on screen, now watched as policy dismantled his life's most meaningful work. And yet, amid the whispers and the mockery, something deeper stirred. He was no stranger to resistance. He had trained through injury, acted through rejection, governed through crisis. But this moment was different. This wasn't about him being doubted. It was about a generation of kids being forgotten. The gallery buzzed quietly during recess. A few legal interns gossiped in the back row. One said, "I thought he was just showing up for PR." Another replied, "Doesn't matter. He got wrecked." A woman in her 50s, one of the few long-time court observers, shook her head. "That man doesn't do anything halfway. Just watch." But even she wasn't sure what he could possibly do next. The law was the law, and the judgment was clear. A television analyst outside recorded a segment live. We're witnessing the limits of celebrity power in a courtroom. Schwarzenegger may have conquered Hollywood and Sacramento, but federal judges don't care about box office numbers. He turned the camera to. It raises a question. When does a man stop being relevant? Arnold remained in his seat, unmoving. Behind his stillness was a flurry of memories. Faces of children, letters he had received over the years. One from a teenager who wrote, "Asterisk, you helped me believe I wasn't trash. That's why I didn't pick up that gun." Asterisk, he carried that letter in his wallet. Still did. He slowly opened the inner pocket of his blazer and touched the paper, creased and faded. His attorney leaned over again. "We might want to prepare a statement for the press. Just something graceful. It's going to be messy out there." Arnold turned to him for the first time in minutes. "No," he said simply. "Not yet." Because deep inside, the gears had begun to turn, not in rage, but in clarity. The game on the surface had ended, but beneath it, a new strategy was forming. One that wouldn't just answer court. It would change the entire conversation. When court reconvened after the brief recess, there was a quiet shift in the atmosphere. The spectators returned to their seats with coffee cups in hand and curiosity in their eyes. But there was no sense of suspense, no expectation of reversal. Most people assumed the story was already written. Arnold Schwarzenegger had made his last appeal, and the law had responded with cold finality. The judge's earlier laughter still echoed faintly in people's minds, a symbol that this case had crossed from argument into something closer to dismissal, if not outright ridicule. Judge Chen returned to the bench with the same deliberate calm. He didn't glance at the defendant's table. He didn't need to. In his view, the legal matter had already been settled. There were still formalities to address, clarifications, procedural notes, and motions to be entered, but the momentum was irreversible. Arnold sat in the exact same position he had held before the break. His hands were folded on the table. His posture hadn't changed. But those watching closely might have noticed something subtle in the tilt of his chin, in the stillness of his breathing. He wasn't absorbing the room anymore. He was studying it. The prosecutor rose first, a hint of confidence in his stride now. "Your Honor, the state would like to formally submit documentation verifying the overdue tax assessments, dated notices of noncompliance with building codes, and fire safety inspection failures from the last 12 months. He placed a binder on the clerk's desk with the precision of someone who believed this was already over. "We also note that Mr. Schwarzenegger's team has not produced any countervailing documentation to dispute these findings." Judge Chen nodded, flipping briefly through the front page of the file before speaking. "The court acknowledges receipt of the state's evidence. These documents further reinforce the procedural and fiscal violations previously discussed." His tone remained professional, but there was an edge of finality in it, as if the judge were gently pushing a door closed. Arnold's attorney stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, we do not dispute the existence of certain procedural deficiencies, but we maintain that immediate enforcement without a transition plan poses grave harm to hundreds of at-risk minors who depend on the Oakland Community Youth Center for daily services." Judge Chen raised his hand before the attorney could continue. "Counsel, this is not a forum for philosophical debate. The legal system does not adjudicate on emotion. We are here to interpret and apply law." The interruption was sharp, definitive. Arnold didn't flinch. The judge continued. The defendant's team has repeatedly framed this as a moral issue, but the legal structure does not grant exceptions for sentiment, no matter how compelling. The center has failed to meet minimum thresholds for public safety, financial accountability, and administrative compliance. The law is clear. No facility, celebrated or not, can continue operation under those conditions. A murmur swept through the room. One of the reporters scribbled the quote word for word. Another typed it into a live update feed. Law trumps legacy in Schwarzenegger hearing. From a corner of the gallery, a young court intern whispered to a colleague, "He's done. They're going to shut it down by Friday." At the defense table, Arnold leaned slightly forward. He didn't speak, but the movement itself was enough to make his attorney glance at him, a flicker of uncertainty passing between them. Judge Chen reached for a second folder. The state's petition for expedited enforcement is hereby granted. The center must cease all public-facing operations within 48 hours. Building access will be restricted pending further review by municipal authorities. He removed his glasses for emphasis. This is not a punishment. It is a protection of the public, of the law, and ultimately, of the principles that prevent governance from becoming personal whim. That word, whim, landed with weight, as if to remind everyone in the room that no amount of reputation, no volume of past service, no historic photo ops or magazine covers could shift the immovable gears of the system. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. No applause, no outrage, just a quiet click of laptop keys, recording the collapse of legacy in real time. Arnold remained still, but inside his mind, the pieces were moving. He could see the press release headlines forming. He could hear the cable panel segments being produced. Former governor's pet project shuttered by court. A legacy folds under legal pressure. But he wasn't thinking about optics. He was thinking about the kids. The ones who had no lawyer, no press team, no platform. The ones who would show up Monday morning to a locked door and a taped notice. Outside the courtroom, someone had written on the sidewalk in chalk, "This center kept me alive." The rain would wash it away by nightfall. Arnold's attorney leaned closer. "We're out of options, sir. I'm sorry." Arnold's response came without pause. "You're not wrong. In here, maybe we are." He looked up at the bench. But outside this room, there's a whole different playing field. The lawyer blinked, confused. "Sir." Arnold didn't elaborate. He simply gathered the loose pages in front of him, neatly aligning them without a word. His breathing was calm, controlled, but in his eyes, the calculation was complete. He wasn't going to fight the ruling. He was going to rewrite the rules. During the lunch recess, the courtroom emptied slowly, like a machine winding down after hours of grinding. The media swarmed the steps outside. Analysts lined up for their live hits. Headlines were already circulating, dissecting the judge's decision. Some called it a blow to celebrity exceptionalism. Others simply wrote, "Arnold loses." But inside a small consultation room down the hall, there was no conversation, no strategizing. Just Arnold, alone at the head of the table, staring down at his phone like a soldier studying a battlefield map. His legal team gave him space. They had already delivered their closing options. There were none. The tray of catered food sat untouched. A paper cup of black coffee cooled by the minute. Arnold scrolled silently through his contacts. Each name he hovered over wasn't random. There were nodes in a network he had built over 4 decades. Athletes, activists, CEOs, state senators, generals. Not fans, not followers. People who had seen the long game, who had bet on something bigger than polls or power. He started dialing. The first call lasted 30 seconds. "I need a copy of that draft bill we discussed in 2021, the one for protecting nonprofit youth centers during funding gaps." The voice on the other end responded with hesitation. That version was shelved. It didn't get past committee. Arnold's reply was crisp. "I don't care. Email it now." The second call was to an old friend in the governor's office. "I need to know which senators are in session. Today. Not next week. Now." There was a pause. "Are you planning to do something?" Arnold cut him off. "I'm not planning. I'm acting. This isn't a favor. It's a call to duty." If they ever believed in what we built, now's the time to prove it. One by one, the calls stacked. Some contacts didn't pick up. Some did, then froze when they heard his voice. A few responded with questions he didn't have time to answer. He gave them a single sentence. I need your name on something that will matter more than any courtroom ruling. By the time his chief counsel returned to the room with a revised motion strategy, Arnold didn't even glance up. We're not submitting anything else, he said. We're done here. The lawyer looked confused. Then what are we doing? Arnold turned his phone around to show an email chain already 20 names deep, all federal and state lawmakers, many of whom had previously worked with him on bipartisan youth initiatives. We're shifting the battlefield. His attorney's face fell. You're not seriously thinking about going around the court. I'm thinking about going above it, Arnold replied. We've been playing inside a system that protects procedure over people. I'm going to change the system, or at least force it to look at itself in the mirror. He opened the document that had just come through, the Community Protection and Justice Reform Act. The title was dry, but the intent behind it burned like fire. It would prohibit courts from dissolving youth-oriented nonprofits without a state-backed transition plan, especially in communities where no viable alternatives existed. It had been written 2 years earlier by a bipartisan coalition, but was quietly dropped when no crisis forced its relevance. Until now, Arnold began revising the language himself, line by line, deleting vague phrasing, tightening definitions, removing anything that sounded like political theater. This wasn't a campaign speech. It was a shield, one that could outlast him. His next call was to a friend in the media, not for a favor, not for spin, but for amplification. I need you to be ready in an hour. There's going to be a statement from inside the courtroom. It won't come from the lawyers. It won't be what they expect. The voice on the other end hesitated. You're going to address the court directly? Arnold nodded to himself. Yes, and it'll be the last thing I say on this matter, but not the last thing they hear. As he finished reviewing the draft, a new email came in, a short video compilation hastily edited by a youth worker from the Oakland Center. It featured clips of former students, now adults, offering short thank yous. One woman, in military fatigues, stared straight into the camera and said, if that place had shut down when I was 15, I'd be in a prison, not the army. Another, a young man with a stethoscope around his neck, smiled. Mr. Arnold taught me how to lead and how to apologize. Both saved my life. Arnold watched in silence. When the final frame faded to black, he set the phone down and looked toward the door. The judge would be returning to the bench soon. There would be no more motions to file, no more objections to raise. But he wasn't returning to defend himself. He was walking back in to propose something the court had no precedent for, something that didn't ask for permission, only understanding. He folded the printed version of the draft bill, slipped it into his coat, and rose without a word. He didn't need a closing argument. He had built a plan no one could dismiss because it wasn't designed to win in court. It was designed to win in history. As the afternoon session resumed, the room settled into a quiet expectancy. The legal formalities were supposed to continue. The judge would confirm enforcement timelines, perhaps offer a brief statement, and then the hearing would conclude. But the rhythm was suddenly broken when Arnold Schwarzenegger stood up from the defendant's table. The gesture was slow, intentional, and carried the weight of someone who had waited for exactly the right moment. Your Honor, he said clearly, his voice cutting to the murmurs like a blade. I respectfully request permission to address the court directly. His attorney looked startled, reaching instinctively to tug his sleeve, whispering under his breath, This isn't protocol, Arnold. But Arnold didn't flinch. His eyes were locked on Judge Chen, who narrowed his gaze for a long second, weighing something silently behind his glasses. This is highly irregular, the judge said, his voice low, measured. But I'll allow it. Proceed. Arnold took 2 steps forward. There was no script, no notepad in hand. Only the presence of a man who had stood on stages and podiums around the world. But never like this. The courtroom held its breath. Earlier today, this court laughed at my defense, he began, without hesitation. And maybe that laugh was justified. Maybe I did walk into this courtroom with too much faith that my past, or my intentions, would matter. He paused. But I've had time to reflect. And I'm not here to re-argue the law. I'm here to propose something unprecedented. The air seemed to thin. In the gallery, journalists exchanged surprised glances, pens frozen above paper. Within 24 hours, Arnold continued, I will personally fund the creation of a $3 billion restitution trust, independently managed with no strings attached. Any individual or organization that can demonstrate operational disruption or financial loss tied to this center's shutdown will be compensated immediately and generously. No lawsuits, no paperwork delays, just relief. Gasps broke out in the back rows. A court clerk's eyes widened. One of the plaintiff's attorneys leaned toward her colleague, whispering furiously. Judge Chen rapped his gavel once. Order. Let him finish. Arnold's tone did not change. In addition, I will contribute $2 billion to the U.S. Securities and Community Oversight Fund, earmarked specifically to develop real-time enforcement technology and youth outreach within underserved districts. And finally, he looked straight at the judge. I will surrender my remaining executive stock options in Tesla and transfer them directly to the factory workers in California and Nevada who helped build everything I've ever stood for. The room burst into chaotic whispers. His lawyer buried his face in both hands. Reporters were already typing mid-sentence. One editor from a legal affairs blog muttered out loud, He's flipping the chessboard. Judge Chen sat back, visibly stunned, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Mr. Schwarzenegger, he said slowly, are you suggesting you will do all of this without a negotiated settlement or any ruling from this court? Yes, Arnold replied. The transfers will begin by midnight, regardless of this court's final position. This is not a deal. It's a commitment. The judge glanced down at his docket, then back at Arnold. And what exactly do you ask in return? Arnold took a deep breath. I ask that the court allow me to acknowledge my failure, without branding it as fraud. No formal finding that would restrict my ability to operate or serve. Let me take responsibility on my terms, not as a way to avoid consequences, but as a way to prove that accountability can be immediate, tangible, and transformative. There was a silence, so complete it felt like the room had been sealed off from time itself. Then slowly, Judge Chen leaned forward, his face unreadable. You're proposing an entirely new category of resolution, Mr. Schwarzenegger, one not found in precedent or policy. I'm proposing what the system was supposed to deliver in the first place, Arnold replied. Justice that heals, not punishes. Justice that works in real time for real people. The judge called an immediate recess and instructed both legal teams to begin drafting formal documentation of the offer. As they scrambled, Arnold stepped back from the podium and returned to his seat, unmoved by the chaos around him. He didn't speak to his lawyers. He didn't check his phone. He simply looked straight ahead, like someone watching a domino fall in slow motion, one that had been standing for far too long. 3 hours later, when court resumed, the terms had been reviewed and verified. The trust structure was legally sound. The asset transfers were real. A list of high-ranking signatories, including sitting senators and governors, had co-signed the accountability framework Arnold proposed. It wasn't just an offer, it was a paradigm shift. Judge Chen reviewed the proposal one final time, his voice lower now, almost contemplative. This court finds Mr. Schwarzenegger's proposal, though unconventional, to exceed the core aims of justice: restitution, prevention, and accountability. The motion for immediate enforcement is therefore suspended pending independent implementation review. He closed the file gently. The court reserves judgment, but it recognizes integrity when it's demonstrated, especially when it's demonstrated in full view of those most affected. As Arnold stood quietly, a reporter near the door whispered into her recorder, he just made the law irrelevant by going further than it ever asked him to. And for the first time all day, Arnold smiled, not out of victory, but because the point had never been to win. It had been to prove there was a better way. The courtroom, one so sure of its trajectory, now felt suspended in a kind of legal twilight. Nothing in the books had prepared it for what had just occurred. The judge, the lawyers, even the reporters, everyone was recalibrating. What Arnold had introduced wasn't a counterargument. It was a new reality, fully formed and already in motion. The system had two choices: follow, or be left behind. Judge Chen sat quietly, fingers laced beneath his chin. For the first time that day, his expression betrayed hesitation. Not weakness, but deep, methodical consideration. Mr. Schwarzenegger, he finally said, you have constructed a remedy that addresses a harm in ways no judicial order could have accomplished. He paused. And yet, this court is not in the business of applause. We are in the business of accountability. Arnold nodded once. I understand. What I'm trying to determine, the judge continued, is whether your actions, however generous, circumvent the legal process itself, whether you've replaced judicial review with personal discretion. I haven't replaced it, Arnold replied calmly. I've filled the gap it left. That sentence landed like a tremor. The prosecutor stood slowly, his earlier confidence dulled into something more cautious. Your Honor, if we allow individuals, no matter how well-intentioned, to rewrite consequences outside a statute, we risk creating a precedent where the wealthy buy their way out of legal conclusions. Arnold didn't wait for permission. That would be true if I were walking away with something. But I'm not. I'm surrendering assets, responsibilities, and the very leadership roles that made me a target for this litigation. I'm not buying silence. I'm building resolution. Judge Chen tapped his pen against the desk. You've offered restitution. You've admitted failure. You've committed to transparency. What you haven't done is show legal cause for this court to stay enforcement under current statute. Arnold opened his coat and placed a single sheet of paper on the clerk's desk. This is the Community Protection and Justice Reform Act, drafted by a bipartisan coalition, co-signed by 23 sitting legislators since this morning. The purpose is to provide a legislative framework for future cases where nonprofit institutions serving vulnerable populations are at risk of abrupt closure due to procedural violations. Judge Chen studied the document. This isn't yet law. No, Arnold said, but it's real. And it was created today because this courtroom made clear what was missing. You asked me earlier whether I had the authority to act. I didn't. So I built the authority. The prosecutor stepped forward again. Even if this legislation passes, it doesn't apply retroactively. Today's matter still requires judicial closure. Then close it, Arnold said, without blinking, but do it knowing that justice already moved forward, not to avoid punishment, to evolve the purpose of the process itself. There was no arrogance in his tone, just resolve. For a moment, it was Judge Chen who seemed to be on trial, not for wrongdoing, but for deciding whether his responsibility was to enforce the past or allow room for future. After a long silence, the judge stood. He turned toward the gallery, filled with journalists, students, city officials, and a handful of community leaders who had quietly entered during the session's second half. The court will recess for 30 minutes for internal deliberation. He exited without another word. Outside the courtroom, the hallway erupted in a different kind of noise. Not chaos, not celebration, but confusion, admiration, disbelief. Reporters whispered into phones. Legal analysts updated live feeds. Social media exploded with real-time reactions. On Twitter, the hashtag #ArnoldJustice trended globally. One commentator posted, "He didn't just beat the system, he upgraded it." Back inside, Arnold sat once more, alone at the defense table. His attorney leaned in and whispered, "I've never seen anything like that." "Neither have I," Arnold replied. But that's why it needed to happen. When Judge Chen returned, he looked different. Not shaken, but reflective. He carried no notes, no binder, just his voice. This court acknowledges that Mr. Schwarzenegger has voluntarily initiated an unprecedented private resolution that fulfills, indeed, exceeds, the compensatory goals of statutory enforcement. The room fell silent again. While such a path is not recognized under formal precedent, the result, immediate restitution, operational redirection, and the advancement of broader policy protections, cannot be ignored. He paused. Therefore, the motion for enforcement is hereby suspended pending third-party oversight of the proposed measures. This court will retain supervisory review but recognizes that further action may be unnecessary. There was no applause, only the sound of people exhaling in disbelief. Arnold stood, not triumphant, but grounded. One journalist typed, "He didn't walk out a hero, he walked out a system architect." As people rose from their seats, the sense in the room was not that something had ended. It was that something entirely new had just begun. 3 weeks after the hearing, the sun rose quietly over Oakland. On a narrow side street lined with chain-link fences and cracked sidewalks, a new bronze plaque was installed outside the community center. It read, "Preserved through action, not argument." Below it, a single name was etched, Arnold Schwarzenegger. But the man himself wasn't there for the unveiling. He hadn't returned to the building since the day he left court. There were no press statements, no interviews. He hadn't posted a single comment online. Because for him, the victory wasn't about being seen. It was about making sure others would be. Inside the center, the halls buzzed with life again. Teenagers took turns reading poetry in a workshop. A college admissions officer from Berkeley sat in the corner office helping a first-generation student write his application. The gym echoed with the sound of sneakers on polished wood. In the counseling room, two young girls laughed softly while braiding each other's hair. No one mentioned courtrooms or legislation. They didn't have to. The future had been returned to them without conditions. But across the country, what happened in that courtroom was anything but quiet. Clips of Arnold's speech have been viewed over 80 million times across platforms. Law schools hosted emergency forums to analyze what had occurred. CNN brought in 6 former federal judges to debate the implications. Harvard Law Review published an editorial titled "Justice by Preemption. Can a Law Compete with Conscience?" One former SEC commissioner called it a new form of legal disruption. Another called it dangerous. But none could deny that it had worked. On Capitol Hill, the Community Protection and Justice Reform Act gained unprecedented bipartisan momentum. In a political climate defined by division, Arnold's act became a rare symbol of alignment, not because it came from celebrity, but because it solved something courts never fully addressed: the gap between compliance and compassion. Within 1 month, the bill passed in California. Within 2, 4 other states began drafting mirror versions. Arnold declined to attend any of the signings. Meanwhile, inside the federal judiciary, closed-door panels debated whether what happened in Judge Chen's courtroom represented a failure of enforcement or a redefinition of its purpose. The judge himself remained silent publicly, but those close to him noticed a subtle change. In lectures he gave at legal seminars, he no longer began with case law. He began with questions. What if the law could learn from its own blind spots? What if dignity didn't have to wait on precedent? One evening, at a legal ethics summit in San Francisco, Judge Chen was approached by a first-year law student. Nervous, eyes wide, she asked, "Did it bother you that he rewrote the ending?" The judge smiled faintly. "He didn't rewrite it," he said. "He forced us to choose a better one." In Los Angeles, a photo was taken without Arnold's knowledge. He was standing outside a warehouse in South Central, watching as volunteers loaded crates of refurbished gym equipment into a truck bound for another struggling youth center, one not yet under threat, but certainly not safe. He wore no suit, no press badge, no speech in hand. Just jeans and a weathered gray hoodie. When asked later why he hadn't turned the courtroom moment into a larger movement, he answered simply, "Because I didn't need to build a brand. I needed to build a bridge." But not everyone was ready to accept the resolution. Critics emerged. Some labeled it elitist theater. Others argued that only someone with Arnold's wealth could have pulled it off. "What happens," one columnist wrote, "when someone with less money but equal conviction tries the same thing and the court slams the door?" Arnold never responded. He didn't have to, because by then, something else had started to happen. In states across America, nonprofit leaders began partnering with lawmakers to codify faster intervention strategies. Private citizens established micro-restoration funds for at-risk community centers, modeled after the Schwarzenegger Trust. Some law professors began teaching what they called third path justice, a term describing solutions that resolve harm through self-directed responsibility without undermining rule of law. But perhaps the most unexpected consequence came from those who had once dismissed Arnold altogether. In an op-ed for a conservative legal blog, a former critic wrote, "I used to see him as a muscle-bound politician with Hollywood instincts. Now I see him as something rarer, a man who used the weight of power not to escape gravity, but to redistribute it." Back in Oakland, on the first Sunday of the month, a small gathering took place at the community center. No press attended. No hashtags trended. But in the corner of the room, a young boy stood at a makeshift podium and read a short essay he had written. "My name is Lionel," he began. "I used to think grown-ups never listened, but then one did, and now I get to dream again." Outside, under the fading gold of afternoon light, the old wooden doors of the center creaked closed to the night, but behind them, something had been kept alive, not because of a judge, not because of a court, but because one man refused to let the system say, "That's just the way it is." And the world, for once, listened,